absolutely just sick of this. Um, Due to life, this is about the best that I can offer in regards to getting this stuff out there. Um, you know, I'm feeling really rather like this is a, you know, it used to be that these platforms allowed for collaboration to happen quickly. Now in this influencer world, you know, I'm not doing this to get views. Obviously, I don't even have the screen oriented right. Okay, and I will admit that. Let me see if I can change it. Actually, let me see. Nope, wouldn't even know how to at this point. So you're gonna have to bear with this orientation. Okay. Let me give a little background. I graduated from Tisch School of the Arts in 2000, and I was a student of the arts. I was a student of the arts, and I remember clearly when I had my first experience with what we call woke, and I never thought it would last. But a lot of the work that I've done has all been based on this book. I'm sorry if it's not oriented right, but it's called Readings in Ritual Studies. This book was a text that was part of the Tisch curriculum. It was published in 1996 by Preeton's Hall and Simon & Schuster in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey. What I'm going to be sharing with you guys is actually the second essay in here, the second paper. And it's called Constructing Ritual by Catherine Bell. What I find interesting to note, by the way, is that even the introduction, like the summation of this paper, is not accurate. I will, you know, take pictures of it and share it, but I want people to understand and listen to what I'm trying to say, sort of was the birth of all this stuff that we're dealing with now. Now, I'm going to ask you guys a couple questions, and, you know, I believe that there is a chat, which I think I can see here, but I'm not so sure. I don't know. So feel free to, you know, chime in with questions. Like I said, I've really lost the ability to, and I haven't had the time to focus on ways to share this in the best way possible, but I think it's so important. And I unfortunately don't know anyone else who's talking about this. I wish there were other people that I could connect with. Now, there's a few people that are discussing the realities of socialist realism or soc realism in the arts. But most of them I've noticed, and I've shared some of the videos recently, are not in America. I've already explained that I think it is a massive mistake that we have not recognized the fact that this deconstruction, even of academics or the academy, like if I knew where to go to get the credentials in order to be able to really discuss this with everyone, I guarantee you I would do it like this, because I'm so passionate about the subject and I feel that it's so important. But more than that is I also believe, my thesis would be, that totalitarian systems are in fact birthed by artifice, which, you know, utilizing the same methodology and, you know, practices that we find in the arts, but then sort of done in a way that reverses the actual liberation that can come out of the arts. In fact, liberation and the arts are entirely connected, because it's what allows a human being to recognize their natural state. Theory and critical reasoning, all of these are new concepts, but something far older than that has been overtaken. So let me put it to you this way: even if you're not in the arts, if you know that, let's say, for example, Christianity was spread throughout the world utilizing the arts. If you've studied anything of art history, you know this. If you have studied anything of Christianity, you know this. Then how come it is so unbelievable that another theology would be spread the same way? Or how about this, that Jonestown, or the People's Temple, was an expression of liberation theology? We already know this. It's not foreign to us. It's not. So, here is something called constructing ritual. And I want you to just notice what is being noticed in this essay. About the author, dates 1953 to New York, education, Manhattanville College, University of Chicago for her PhD. Fields, Chinese religion, history of religious methodology, ritual studies. Career, associate professor, Department of Religious Studies, Santa Clara University. Publications, The Ritual Dimensions of Religion. Ritual Theory, Ritual Practice, Oxford University, 1992. The author's main focus of research and publish is Chinese religion. You see what I'm getting at? I hope I don't have to do a overarching statement on this. It's kind of clear. Here's what she said. Theoretical descriptions of ritual, generally regarded as action, and thus automatically distinguish it from the conceptual aspects of religion, such as beliefs, symbols, and myths. Now, if you're wondering where I'm getting at, remember those dancing nurses? Remember how clear and how, once it was explained, so many of you felt relief? I'm trying to show you how it's a terrific example of what I'm calling the dictatorship of the ritual. This is a phrase, by the way, that I didn't coin. It's a phrase coined by Václav Havel in the essay Power of the Powerless. He said that what appears to be a dictatorial regime isn't. If anything, we're experiencing what he described as the dictatorship of the ritual. Now, he was a playwright. Mao was a poet. His wife was a dancer. So is it really so difficult to believe that a poet trained in the West, whose wife was a dancer, who was responsible for the murder of millions, who had a vision for long after he passed away, wouldn't have a cult-like following that knew exactly what it was doing? And as we all know, the universities were first overtaken within their humanities departments and social studies, social sciences. Look around. What I'm saying here fits. I'm trying to point to this because there's a way out. And it doesn't require a group of mass. It doesn't require a majority. But if we don't start understanding this, there is no way to solve this. There's a mythology around there that economic decrees and, politics can solve these problems. It can't. So let me explain to you, through their words here, what was being noticed back then. She goes on. In some cases, added qualifications may soften the distinction, but rarely do such descriptions question this immediate differentiation or the usefulness of distinguishing what is thought from what is done. Likewise, beliefs, creeds, and symbols, and myths emerge as forms of mental content or conceptual blueprints. They direct, inspire, or promote activity, but they themselves are not activities. Ritual, like action, will act out, express, or perform these conceptual orientations. To keep something in mind, if we're going to use the COVID policies as an example, I've said this many times, masking was a ritual. It's a very obvious one. But there are others, okay? Now, ritual is not the same thing as a habit. To cite another reference, what we have to understand is that when ritual is usually three parts: ritual time, ritual space, ritual action. The Super Bowl is a ritual. So is a wedding. Now recognize too, all of our rituals were removed for a period of time. All of our burial rites, What was it replaced with? Just ritual determined as being acceptable by party, or parthenos, party spirit. She continues, ritual, like action, will act out, express, or perform these conceptual orientations. Sometimes the push for typological clarity will drive such differentiations to the extreme. Ritual is then described as particularly thoughtless action, routinized, habitual, obsessive, or mimetic, and therefore the purely formal, secondary, and mere physical expression of logically prior ideas, just as the differentiation of ritual and belief in terms of thought and action is usually taken for granted. So too is the priority this differentiation accords to thought. For example, Edward Shills argues that ritual and belief are intertwined, and yet separable, since it is conceivable that one might accept beliefs but not the ritual activities associated with them. He concludes that logically, therefore, quote, beliefs could exist without rituals. Rituals, however, could not exist without beliefs. Claude Levi-Strauss takes this logic much further when an initial distinction between ritual and myth eventuates in a distinction between living and thinking. Aside from this basic structural pattern in which ritual is differentiated from mental categories as readily as action is differentiated from thought, there is a second structural pattern in theoretical discussions of ritual. The second pattern describes ritual as a type of functional or structural mechanism to reintegrate the thought-action dichotomy, which may appear in the guise of a distinction between belief and behavior, or any number of other homologous pairs. Both of these structural patterns, the differentiation of ritual as action from thought, and the portrayal of ritual as a mechanism for integration, thought, and action, can be demonstrated in several representative approaches to ritual. Durkheim argued that religion is composed of beliefs and rites. Beliefs consist of representations of the sacred. Rites are determined modes of action that can be categorized only in terms of the representations of the sacred that are the object. Between these two classes of facts, he wrote, there is all the difference which separates thought from action. Yet, despite the secondary nature of ritual given in these initial definitions, Durkheim's important discussion of cult at the end of the elementary forms reintroduces ritual as the means by which collective beliefs and ideals are simultaneously generated, experienced, and affirmed as real by the community. Hence, ritual is the means by which individual perception and behavior are socially appropriated or conditioned. In Durkheim's model, the ritual activity of cult constitutes the necessary interaction between the collective representations of social life as a type of mental or meta-mental category, and individual experience and behavior as a category of activity. These two patterns turn up also in another loosely structural model employed with great sophistication by Stanley Tombia, but more simplistically by many others. There, ritual is provisionally distinguished as the synchronic, continuous, traditional, or ontological in opposition to the dichronic, changing historical or social. However, ritual is also subsequently portrayed as the arena in which such pairs of forces interact. It is the mediating process by which the synchronic comes to be re-expressed in terms of the diachronic, and vice versa. A third model, presented most fully in the early work of V. Turner, also portrays these two patterns. Turner initially described ritual as the affirmation of communal unity in contrast to the frictions, constraints, and competitiveness of social life and organization. Rite affords a creative anti-structure that is distinguished from the rigid maintenance of social orders, hierarchies, and traditional forms. However, when subsequently portrayed as embodying aspects of both structure and anti-structure, he describes rituals as those special, paradigmatic activities that mediate or orchestrate the necessary and opposing demands of both communitas and the formalized social order. Each of these examples employs the two structural patterns described previously. Ritual is first differentiated as a discrete object of analysis by means of various dichotomies that are loosely analogous to thought and action. Then, ritual is subsequently elaborated as the very means by which these dichotomies categories, neither of which could exist without the other, are reintegrated. These two structural patterns are rarely explicit, and the first, in particular, in which ritual is differentiated from conceptual categories, is routinely taken for granted. However, the relationship that develops between these two patterns, when they are simultaneously operative in a theoretical description of ritual, is even less acknowledged and much more powerful. In effect, the dichotomy that isolates ritual on the one hand, and the dichotomy that is mediated by ritual on the other, become loosely homogenized with each other. Essentially, as I will demonstrate, the underlying dichotomy between thought and action continues to push for a loose systemization of several levels of homogenized dichotomies, including the relationship between the ritual observer and the ritual actor. It is this invisible process of homologization, driven by the implicit presence of an opposition between conceptual and behavioral categories, that begins to construct a persuasive and apparently logical body of discourse. Dichotomies and dialectics. Jameson analyzes a type of logical structure within linguistic theory that is similar to these two patterns sketched out earlier for ritual theory. Note, this was a ritual studies book, not a ritual theory book. There's a difference. Theory, you'll hear it here shortly. It's a linguistic game. I would dare say it's worse than that. Is it so hard to believe? Really believe what I'm about to read to you? That it's not like casting a spell. And it can only be undone utilizing the same kind of thoughts, artfully, spiritually, poetically. As Ian McGilchrist says, we are living in a left hemisphere dominated world. This has nothing to do with things that are easily quantifiable or directly in front of you. I'm going to continue now. Dichotomies and dialectics. Jameson analyzes a type of logical structure within linguistic theory that is similar to two patterns sketched out earlier for ritual theory. The structured argument that he isolates provides a useful contrast to the one I am recovering here. Jameson points to a logical structure in which an initial differentiation originally proposed to enable the theorist to concentrate on just one of the differentiated terms surfaces again and again within subsequent analysis of that term. Specifically addressing Ferdinand Saussure's system of linguistics, Jameson shows that an initial distinction between structure and history, synchrony and diachrony, enables Saussure to focus upon and systematically elucidate one aspect of language, the synchronic or structural aspect. However, Saussure never resolved or transcended the dichotomy between synchrony and diachrony, but reproduced it, even in the final terms of his system. How did such a replication occur? As an aside, in my Substack, I explain that what we're dealing with is a mechanized religion with a methodology of absorbing all into its own genesis and recreating itself. Here's how part of how it does it. In reaction against historicism in linguistics, Jameson explains, Saussure attempted to talk about the non-historical aspects of language. On a primary level, he distinguished between diachrony and synchrony, thereby providing himself a clear focus on the synchronic side of linguistics, as opposed to the other side, where he argued everyone else was working. On a second level, and therefore within the synchronic system itself, Saussure also distinguished between langue and parole, in order to further differentiate synchronic language from speech. He therein had his first internal replication of the original proposition. On yet a third level, Saussure took langue as a system, and within it distinguished two ways in which signs are related: the syntagmatic and the associative, or paradynamic, replicating his original dichotomy for a second time within the system as a whole. The original differentiation between diachrony and synchrony was applied throughout various aspects and various parts of categories to three levels of analysis. In other words, the continual application of the dichotomy between synchrony and diachrony systematically generated successive and homologous levels of analysis. See? Antithesis. This is where it began. At this point, Jameson suggests that it became quite problematical to what degree the object of study is the thought pattern of the linguist himself, rather than that of the language. Moreover, this is also the point at which the originality of Saussure's initial distinction becomes a constraint on the whole system he has generated from it. Saussure's initial repudiation of history, remarks Jameson, which at the very outset resulted in an inability to absorb change into the system as anything but a meaningless and contingent datum, is now reproduced at the very heart of the system itself as an inability to deal with syntax as such. Theoretical discourse on ritual displays a similar logical structure, a distinction between belief and rite, made as readily as the heuristic distinction between thought and action clears the way to focus on ritual alone. This is the first structural pattern noted previously. Ritual, however, becomes in turn a new starting point at which to differentiate once again between conceptual and behavioral components. This is the second structural pattern described earlier. However, ritual theory goes on to do something that Saussure, in the rigor of his focus and logic, according to Jameson, failed to do, namely, provide a stage of synthetic integration. Differentiated from belief in the first structural pattern, ritual becomes a second point at which to distinguish thought and action. Yet at the second stage, ritual is seen as synthetic, as the very mechanism or medium which thought and action are integrated. The elaboration of ritual as a mechanism for the fusion of opposing categories simultaneously serves both to differentiate and unite a set of terms. That is the second structural pattern in ritual theory, in which ritual mediates thought and action, posits a dialectical relation between the differentiated entities instead of replicating an unmediated dichotomy. Ritual emerges as the means for a provisional synthesis of some form of the original opposition. Now regard the dancing nurses again. It's obvious. You don't need to be a brain surgeon to understand this. So Sartre generated his linguistic system by positing an initial distinction, the successive and systematic replication of which rendered the distinction an ahistorical, non-dialectical, or pure opposition. Most ritual theory avoids this by incorporating the notion of dialectic or synthesis. Ritual is a dialectical means for the provisional convergence of those opposed forces whose interaction is seen to constitute culture in some form. Let me repeat that. Most ritual theory avoids this by incorporating the notion of dialectic or synthesis. Ritual is a dialectical means for the provisional convergence of those opposed forces whose interaction is seen to constitute culture in some form, aka following the science. You are making a determination that this is culture and then you reverse it. You use ritual in order to prove your thesis. The three representative theories of ritual briefly described earlier present ritual as just such a medium of integration or synthesis for opposing sociocultural forces. These are not isolated examples. There is a strong impetus within theoretical studies of religion and culture for this type of dialectic. This impetus can be seen, for example, in contemporary evaluation of Durkheim's theory of ritual. Some argue that his notion of ritual contains a dialectical mediation of the social and of the individual. Others argue that its fundamental weakness is precisely that his notion of ritual lacks such a dialectic. E. Evans Pritchard has pinpointed Durkheim's theory of ritual as the central but most obscure and unconvincing part of his notion of society and religion. Nancy Munn, on the other hand, has found it to be of signal importance for ritual studies today. She argues that Durkheim developed a model of social ritual symbolism as the switch point between the external moral constraints and groupings of the socio-political order and the internal feelings and imaginative concepts of the individual actor. Remember, the art of folk realism was created by critics, theoricians, writers, and artists as a means to engineer human souls. Listen with that in mind. Although it is precisely the nature of this switch point that Evan Pritchard finds obscure, Munn is clearly attempting to find, rooted in Durkheim, dialectical relationship between two irreducible entities, the individual's subjective state and the communal order, a dialectic mediated, therefore, by the collective representations generated and appropriated in the cult. Solons has also looked for a synthetic reintegration of thought and action, self and society within Durkheim's theory, and not found it. He argues that Durkheim's collective representations fail to mediate at all. So for some background, Durkheim is the root of where we see people now dealing with criminal theory. Durkheim is the argument made for why we should be emptying out prisons. You see? It is a war on memory. People were trying in the universities, in the arts, and what happened to them? Same thing that always happens to them. She continues, rather, as idealized representations of social values and structures, they merely act upon subjective states to mold them. For Solons, Durkheim's collective representations are unable to mediate or re-articulate individual experience within social categories. All they can do is simply appropriate and organize it into a meta-language. This is why I keep saying queer theory has nothing to do with the civil rights of human beings, gays, not at all. Liberation theology or women's liberation, nothing to do with equality for women. Nothing. Just like, they're claiming that this is somehow the fault of Jews for spreading this is utter nonsense. It's nonsense. Utter nonsense. Sippy, I'm originally from New York City. I moved to Florida. My family's Hungarian and also American. My grandfather died in a gulag. We're Jews that escaped Hungary. But my grandfather died in a gulag, Stalinist gulag. And I left New York City because I could not get the vaccine. And I experienced the ritualized, what they call the political witch hunt ritual, which was an expansion on the Durkheim ritual explanation. And I elaborated this on Twitter. I predicted it. It's the way I was able to also see what was going on with the dancing nurses. See, she says that in a somewhat similar argument, Levi Strauss suggested that Durkheim lacked an adequate notion of a symbol and symbolic action. That is, in contrast to how symbols function. Durkheim's collective representations are mere signs, idealizations of the forms of social morphology that have become independent of these forms and thus act solely to subordinate and structure individual perception and experience. That is exactly what Empower the Powerless Václav Havel says about the empty phrase, such as, why do people say, did they say workers of the world unite? Why were people saying Black Lives Matter? Listen again, or Christ is King. Listen to what she's saying here. Durkheim, who, by the way, again, I'm apparently a crackhead. I love this comment here. It motivates me to keep going. Thank you, Mr. Myers, 101. So, once again, here we go. Irrelevant, Sippy. I'm staying, of course, on here. I'm talking about ritual here. I'm not talking about individuals, nor am I talking about a collective. This is the point. I'm talking about something very key here. Okay. Durkheim's collective representations. Now remember too, it's all his theory on what constitutes the manufacturing of deviance, the manufacturing of criminality, the manufacturing of and othering of something being rooted in a sense that communities do this in order to create a social order. But what is lacking here is actually what creates the motivation beyond a normal social order. Just like when people say that liberation theology is, in fact, has nothing to do with the people. It's actually from the Leninist perspective of a overthrowing of the pillars of the house by the upper classes, as it always is, with power, and it's done down. When you can predict such a thing will happen, what is expanded on in another essay, and just keep this in mind as I'm reading this, was another social scientist noticed that as the relationship between the state and corporate actors as fueling the state, we see he predicted an increased spread and instance of what he called the political witch hunt ritual, which is what exactly happened during COVID and what continues to happen now. And it happens over and over and over. Like she said, once this methodology is used, it's like a Russian nesting doll. It self-reinforces and spreads. I'm now going to be ignoring probably the chat because I find it amusing that somebody would say to me, no one believes in you. God, get help. So sweet, so quaint. Absolutely not. I don't care what a stranger says to me on here. Why would I? The fact that there are people saying such a thing just motivates me more. Because they're wrong. And frankly, I don't need anyone to come between me and God. And there are plenty of people who do believe me. And I don't care if some people say in mass that they don't believe me. I don't need them, and neither do you. We don't need a mass movement. That's the point. That's what Vaslov brilliantly explains in Power of the Palace. We don't need them any more than we needed them during the COVIDian bullshit. This is the same tactic. I couldn't care less. They always call you stupid. They always call you crazy. Always. Like I said, it's a mechanized religion demanding conformity and introversion. We give them neither. I'm rather enjoying seeing these comments. Let them come. Durkheim's collective representations are mere signs, idealizations of the forms of social morphology that have become independent of these forms, and thus act solely to subordinate and structure individual perception and experience. Case in point. Ultimately, Solons and Levi-Strauss find Durkheim's theory of cult and ritual action less than complete for two reasons. First, it does not generate a level of cultural analysis as such. And second, it does not overcome the fundamental duality that resurfaced for Durkheim even in his portrayal of human nature itself. Quote, "This is the objective foundation of the idea of the soul. Those representations whose flow constitutes our interior life are of two different species, which are irreducible one into the another. Some concern themselves with the external and material world, others with an ideal world, to which we attribute a moral superiority over the first. For Durkheim, therefore, we are really made up of two beings facing in different, almost contrary directions, one of whom exercises a real preeminence over the other. Such is the profound meaning of the antithesis, which all men have more or less clearly conceived between the body and the soul, the material and the spiritual beings who coexist within us." End quote. Whether Durkheim provides a complete notion of ritual or not, we can see in his work and in the arguments of those reading him a tendency to isolate two types of socio-cultural processes or entities, and then to seek in ritual theory a model of their necessary reintegration. Indeed, given any initial avowal or assumption of such differentiated process, a theoretician would have to come up with some phenomenon structured to mediate them if it did not already exist. Hence, I am suggesting that descriptions of how rituals work have been constructed according to a logic rooted in the dynamics of theoretical speculation, and the unconscious manipulation of thought-action dichotomy is intrinsic to this construction. Saussure could not see how his initial distinctions radically limited the descriptive power of his system. Likewise, we do not see how such dichotomies as continuity and change, individual experience and social forms and beliefs and behavior invoke an assumption about thought and action that runs particularly deep in the intellectual traditions of Western culture. We do not see that we are wielding a particularly powerful analytical tool, nor do we see how our unconscious manipulation of it is driven not only by the need to resolve the dichotomy it establishes, but also simultaneously to affirm and resolve the more fundamental opposition it poses, the opposition between the theoretician and the object of theoretical discourse. In other words, we do not see how such dichotomies contribute to the relational definition of a knower, a known, and a particular type of knowledge. Gertz and the window of ritual. To clarify the relationship between dichotomies and dialectics within the structure of ritual theory, a fuller example is needed to demonstrate how a coherent discourse on ritual is generated. The work of Goetz provides an excellent extended illustration for this purpose. Goetz has been a major influence in the study of religion and ritual, as well as a navigator for many through the shoals and reefs of various methodological issues. This is due in part to the symmetry of his terminology, its appeal to common sense, and his richly anecdotal ethnographies in which texture and nuance appear to defy ethnographic reductionism. Notice, she talks about defying ethnographic reductionism. Isn't that exceptional? See, it's all there. We don't have to remake the wheel, people. We just have to reconstruct what was deconstructed. It's all there. Goetz maintains that the thrust of his theoretical approach to the explanation of meaning in cultural phenomena. With this focus, he wishes to go beyond the functional or mechanistic analysis of human activity that he correlates with the reductionism of subordinating either the social to the cultural or vice versa. Basic to this project is a distinction between ethos and worldview. Ethos designates the moral and aesthetic aspects of a culture, a people's underlying attitude toward themselves and their world. Ethos. Elsewhere, Goetz describes ethos in terms of dispositions, defined not as activity, but as the likelihood of activity taking place under certain circumstances. Such dispositions are, in turn, further differentiated into two kinds: moods and motivations. Worldview, on the other hand, indicates for Goetz the cognitive, existential aspects of a culture, a people's sense of the really real, their most comprehensive idea of a general order of existence. Understood in this way, these two terms clearly lend themselves to a polarization in which ethos is to worldview as action is to thought. At times, Goetz explicitly correlates religious ritual with ethos and religious belief with worldview, thus invoking the first structural pattern in which ritual is taken for activity in contrast to belief as thought. At other times, he presents ethos and worldview as synthesized, fused, or stored in symbols that are arranged in various systems, patterns, or control mechanisms, such as ritual, art, religion, language, and myth. However, these systems do not only store a synthesis of ethos and worldview, they are also seen to affect it. Goetz argues, with regard to ritual, that, quote, any religious ritual, no matter how apparently automatic or conventional, involves this symbolic fusion of ethos and worldview. Here, the second structural pattern appears in which ritual involves the integration of thought and action categories. The dialectical nature of this fusion of ethos and worldview is made clear in Goetz's related discussion of symbolic systems, such as religion, which involve both models for and models of reality. These systems are culture patterns. That is, they give meaning or objective form to social and psychological reality, both by shaping themselves to it and by shaping it to themselves. With regard to ritual per se, Goetz suggests that it is in some sort of ceremonial form, even if that form be hardly more than the recitation of a myth, the consolation of an oracle, or the decoration of a grave, that the moods and motivations which sacred symbols induce in men, and the general conceptions of their order of existence which they formulate for men, meet and reinforce one another. He goes on, in ritual, the world as lived and the world as imagined fused under the agency of a single set of symbolic forms turns out to be the same world. Here, the simplest ritual activities are seen to fuse a people's conceptions of order and their dispositions, moods, and motivations for action. For Goetz, this opposition of conceptions and dispositions, or the world as imagined and the world as lived, constitutes cultural life per se. Moreover, perception and analysis of their opposition and resolution constitute a theoretical explanation of meaning in culture. Indeed, failure to grasp the interaction of these two fundamentally differentiated categories, conceptions and dispositions, is tantamount to the reductionism that Goetz specifically decries. The reductionism of the social to the cultural, or the cultural to the social. Thus, the dichotomous nature of conceptions of order, worldview, and dispositions for action, ethos, is fundamental to Goetz's approach, as is their resolution in such symbolic systems as ritual. The temporary resolution of a dichotomy is cast as the central dynamic of cultural life. So far, this analysis of Goetz has simply invoked the two structural patterns discussed earlier. However, Goetz also reveals a third pattern and the further implications of his model of ritual. He goes on to explain that cultural performances, such as religious ritual, are not only the point at which the dispositional and conceptual aspects of religious life converge for the believer, but also the point at which the interaction between them can be most readily examined by the detached observer. What does he mean by this? Since ritual enacts, performs, or objectifies religious beliefs, action gives expression to a thought, and in doing so, actually fuses the conceptual and the dispositional aspects of religious symbols. Ritual integrates thought and action. Goetz must be concluding that ritual offers a special vantage point for the theorist to observe these processes. Why and how, we might ask, does ritual work to facilitate the theorist's project? The answer is left implicitly in Goetz's text. To answer explicitly, we need to retrace the homogenizations that silently push his argument forward. Outsiders, state Goetz, will see in ritual only the mere presentation of a particular religious perspective, which they may appreciate aesthetically or analyze scientifically. Neither response, he implies, penetrates into the real meaning and dynamics of such a cultural phenomenon. For to participants, on the other hand, rites are enactments, materializations, realizations of a particular religious perspective. Not only models of what they believe, but also models for the believing of it. If you look in my YouTube channel, you'll see that I did a parody on what was going on with masking. Imagine me wearing a mask, Biden, Fauci, Build Back Better, can see in the ritual action. I'll say this again. That it's not only models of what they believe, but also models for the believing of it. So when faced with a manipulative ritual, which is all over liberation theology, all over it, everywhere, we can see how this can be communicated and how dangerous it is. Thus, the outsider has only conceptual categories with which he or she approaches the ritual activity. Participants, in contrast, actually experience in the rite the integration of their own conceptual framework and dispositional imperatives. In this argument, Gertz is setting up a third structural pattern and a third permutation of the thought-action dichotomy. That is, ritual participants act, whereas those observing them think. In ritual activity, conceptions and dispositions are fused for the participants, which yields meaning. Meaning, for the outside theorist, comes differently, insofar as he or she can perceive in ritual the true basis of its meaningfulness for the ritual actors. That is, its fusion of conceptual and dispositional categories. Then the theorist can go beyond mere thoughts about activity to grasp the meaningfulness of the ritual. That is why, when I clarified for people what was going on with the nurses, that creepy feeling, that felt confusion in the meaning, that's what I did. That's all. By recognizing the ritual mechanism of meaningfulness for participants, the theorist, in turn, can grasp its meaningfulness as a cultural phenomenon. Ritual activity can then become meaningful to the theorist. Thus, a cultural focus on ritual activity renders the rite a veritable window on the most important process of cultural life. Slipping in by virtue of its homologization with the other two structural patterns, the third one organizes the argument in such a way that the theoretical explanation of meaning is itself a fusion of thought and action. The theorist thought, conceptual categories, and the activity of the ritual participants, which is also a fusion of conceptions and disposition in its own right. Herein lies the implicit structural homology. The fusion of thought and action, described within ritual, is homogenized to a fusion of the theoretical project and its object, ritual activity. Both generate meaning, the first for the ritual actor, and the second for the theorist. Another example of an argument for a particular relationship between the project of the outside observer and the project of the ritual is laid out by Theodore Jennings. Jennings describes ritual as, first of all, a display to an observer, God, theorist, etc., or observers, the community itself. And second, as an epistemological project. Both of these dimensions of ritual act as a point of contact between the rite and the attempt by outside observers to grasp a theoretical, critical understanding of this. We need not castigate our pursuit of the meaning of ritual as voyeurism or whoring, Jennings asserts, since our cognitive concerns are simply an extension of those of the ritual we are invited to watch. Now, doesn't the whole bullshit about cultural appropriation tactically seem brilliant? We already knew what bullshit that was. All the delicate assumptions of Jennings' approach find their inevitable contrast in Stephen Greenblatt's account of the epistemological project of the amateur ethnographer. Excuse me. Captain John G. Bork. Bork witnessed among the Zuni Indians extreme and simultaneous violations of the codes governing food and waste, and hence experienced extreme disgust. His reaction, Greenblatt speculates, was not simply an occupational hazard. After all, it is the ethnographer's nausea that gives him his particular discursive field. The parameters of Bork's lengthy 1891 opus, Scatological Rights of All Nations, were defined, asserts Greenblatt, precisely by the rising of his gorge. It would be absurd, he continues, to conclude that a similar, if better disguised, revulsion lies at the constitutive moment of all ethnography. But one may easily find other and more respectable instances than the work of Captain Bork, in which aversion serves to transform behavior and material substances into the objects of representation and interpretation. Greenblatt suggests that Bork instinctively depended on his revulsion to define his epistemological project and the otherness it both required and established. Gertz and Jennings, in contrast, would have us depend on the essential congruity or likeness of doing ritual and generating theoretical interpretations of ritual to establish both our difference from and access to the other. Constructing meaning. The result for Gertz of the convergence of concepts and dispositions affected by ritual is the theorist's understanding of the cultural meaning of a ritual. What is this meaning exactly? What does it render meaningful and meaningless? Citing Milton Singer, Gertz suggests how the convergence of affected in ritual enables one to understand the way in which people regard their religion as encapsulated in specific performances that can be performed for visitors and themselves. He quotes with much approval a well-known passage by Singer, quote, "Whenever Madrasi Brahmins and non-Brahmins too, for that matter, wished to exhibit to me some features of Hinduism, they always referred to or invited me to see a particular rite or ceremony in the life cycle, in a temple festival, or in the general sphere of religious and cultural performances. Reflecting on this in the course of my interviews and observations, I found that the more abstract generalizations about Hinduism, my own as well as those I heard, could generally be checked directly or indirectly against these observable performances." Singer's comments are presented as the discovery of an insightful method. They are also, however, an excellent example of the naturalness of the thought-action dichotomy in ritual discourse. First, in regard to Hinduism, he says that the Hindus have rites which they enact or exhibit, whereas the researcher has concepts which can be thought or talked about. As a consequence of this distinction, the particularity of any one local ritual is contrasted with the more embracing abstract generalizations of the researcher. Second, such rites are seen not only as a very particular enactment of that abstract totality, Hinduism, but they are also portrayed as enactments exhibited to others for evaluation or appropriation in terms of their more purely theoretical knowledge. Third, because enactment of the rite is already implicitly constructed as an effecting an integration of participants between a supposed conceptual totality, Hinduism, and the practical need of a particular time and place, the dispositions within the ritual context, the researcher easily sees in the exhibition of these rites for theoretical interpretation an equally effective convergence of theory and practice on another level. Our conceptual abstractions integrated with their specific practices. Thus, a model of ritual based upon our two structural patterns in which ritual is both activity and the fusion of thought and activity ultimately involves a third pattern, one in which the dichotomy underlying a thinking theorist and an acting actor is simultaneously affirmed and resolved. It is this homogenation that makes ritual appear to provide such a privileged vantage point on culture and the meaningfulness of cultural phenomena. To question Gertz or Singer's appreciation of the way that ritual obliges the detached observer is to discover that ritual does so by virtue of those very features with which it has been theoretically constructed in the first place. Again, we are faced with the same question raised by Jameson. To what extent is the object of study the thought pattern of the theorist rather than the supposed object, ritual. You've seen in Goethe's work not only the two patterns of thought-action dichotomy described here, but a third one as well. First, ritual was said to dramatize, enact, materialize, or perform a system of symbols. This formulation invokes the notion that activity is a secondary physical manifestation or expression of thought. Second, by enacting the symbolic system, ritual was said to integrate two irreducible aspects of symbols, the conceptual worldview and the dispositional ethos. In this way, a thought-action dichotomy is inscribed within the opposing socio-structural cultural forces that Goethe isolates in order to be subsequently resolved in the performance of the rite. On the third level, or in a third structural pattern, ritual as performance likewise enables the integration of the theorist's abstract conceptual categories and the cultural particularity of the rite. With this third level of pattern, the thought-action dichotomy has differentiated native ritual as activity from the thought of the theorist, while casting the resolution of this thought-action opposition in a theoretical grasp of the meaning of the ritual acts. What constitutes meaning for the ritual actors is seen as the integration of their conceptual and dispositional orientations that take place in the ritual. What constitutes meaning for the theorist is the same model. The integration of his or her conceptual categories with the ritual dispositions of the native actors, and integration afforded by proper analysis of ritual. To restate the structure of this argument more formally is to make ludicrously explicit a type of logic that is effective only when left unexamined. Most simply, we might say, ritual is to the symbols it dramatizes as action is to thought. On a second level, ritual integrates thought and action, and on a third level, a focus on ritual performance integrates our thoughts and their actions. The opposition of the theorist and the ritual object becomes homogenized with two other oppositions, namely the opposition that differentiates ritual, beliefs versus activities, and the opposition of two fundamental sociocultural forces that are resolved by ritual, conceptual versus dispositional forces. This homology is achieved by a hidden appeal to a type of common denominator, the opposition of thought and action. In the end, a model of ritual that integrates opposing sociocultural forces becomes homogenized to a mode of theoretical discourse that reintegrates the dichotomy underlying the identification of a thinking theorist and an acting object. Think back to the dancing nurses again. Thinking theorist, acting object. In-group, out-group. All of liberation theology is rooted in this. It's very clarifying. And I also hope freeing when you realize it. This type of expedient logic carries another inevitable corollary. However, that is, theories of ritual which attempt to integrate thought and action in any guise simultaneously function to maintain their differentiation. This type of discourse on ritual not only constructs a model that integrates a thinking observer and an acting object, it simultaneously functions to distinguish them clearly. The resolution of a dichotomy functions to affirm the polarity of the terms involved. The implications, therefore, of differentiating an object and a subject on the basis of thought and action are rather striking. At this point, a final example further illustrates the circular logic built up by these homologies and the theory of ritual that emerges. When ritual fails. Is that a vape? That was a vape. This is now a cigarette, and I don't recommend it. I'm not promoting it, but I'm having one because this upsets me, this stuff. I'm doing something Just because I want to sort of outside the collective helps. What can I say? I don't encourage it, nor do I discourage it. I don't know you. You shouldn't take such personal things personally. I'm trying to share somebody's ideas with you. That I think is important. You're free to stay, free to go. In a study, when ritual fails, in a study of a Javanese funeral ceremony, Gertz ventured to analyze a ritual which failed to function properly. The analysis is simple and compelling. He begins by discussing the inability of functionalism to deal with social change and transformational social processes. The reason for this, he suggests, is the tendency of functional theory to identify social conflict as disintegration